Most people think wealth is a pile of numbers. I have never believed that. What I have believed for a very long time is that wealth is measured by what your savings can still buy when the rules of the system begin to move under your feet. That is a very different thing. A man can feel rich because the number in his account is large. A retiree can feel safe because the bond statement still arrives on time. A middle-class family can feel responsible because the checking account is positive, the mortgage is current, and the retirement plan is fully invested. Then the measuring stick changes. Then the currency begins to lose credibility faster than most people can emotionally process. Then the quiet transfer begins. And the people who thought they were preserving wealth discover they were only preserving digits. That is the danger I want to talk about. I do not start with fear. I start with pattern recognition. As of 2024, global debt has moved past $315 trillion. That is not a normal number. It is not the kind of number a healthy system produces by accident. It is the kind of number that tells you the world has spent many years pulling future demand into the present and calling the result prosperity. At the same time, the United States has taken the logic of modern money creation further than any great power before it. In just the last handful of years, the volume of money created and debt absorbed has been staggering. Meanwhile, central banks from China to Russia to Saudi Arabia and beyond have not been writing essays about their concerns. They have been buying gold, not paper promises, not fashionable slogans, physical gold stored, secured, and increasingly placed in a way that reduces dependence on the dollar system. That combination matters. When debt explodes, when the reserve issuer keeps stretching its balance sheet, and when foreign monetary authorities begin accumulating hard reserve assets at the fastest pace in decades, I do not treat it as noise. I treat it as a signal. And history has taught me that these signals do not appear at random. The world does not transfer wealth in one dramatic theatrical moment. It does it through a mechanism. That mechanism has repeated itself across centuries. The flags change. The language changes. The instruments become more sophisticated. The speeches become more polished. But the mechanism remains stubbornly familiar. A dominant power builds credibility. Then it spends that credibility. Then it leans on that credibility. Then it assumes that credibility can never run out. Then the world starts making plans for life after that credibility. That is how the shift begins. It is not announced with a trumpet. It begins with trust thinning at the edges. It begins with trade partners asking uncomfortable questions. It begins with foreign ministries, central banks, sovereign wealth pools, commodity producers, and large holders of reserves deciding that concentration in one monetary order is no longer prudent. The ordinary saver usually notices at the very end. By then the headlines are loud. By then the options are more expensive. By then the easy protection is gone. I have spent my life thinking about capital allocation. Good capital allocation requires understanding, not only businesses, but also the environment in which all business is measured. A wonderful company can still disappoint you if the unit in which its value is denominated is quietly being degraded. A mediocre asset can appear brilliant if the denominator is losing integrity. This is why people become confused in periods like this. They look at nominal prices and think they are looking at truth. They are often looking at distortion. Every major wealth transfer I have ever studied follows a recognizable path. At the beginning, a leading power establishes control. Sometimes it does it through military strength, sometimes through industrial supremacy, sometimes through trade dominance, sometimes through financial innovation, usually through a blend of all four. Once the new order is established, the leading power gets the privilege of setting standards. Its currency becomes central. Its legal system becomes trusted. Its debt becomes desirable. Its institutions appear permanent. At that stage, everybody wants in. The system works well enough that its authority looks natural. Trade expands. Living standards rise. Confidence deepens. The center nation benefits more than anyone else because it writes the rules and settles the claims. Then comes the dangerous middle. The dominant power begins to confuse privilege with permanence. Borrowing rises, spending rises, moral discipline weakens. The currency begins to be stretched. Sometimes rulers clip coins, sometimes governments suspend convertibility, Sometimes central banks monetize what markets cannot comfortably absorb. Sometimes all of it is dressed up in modern language and sold as flexibility. At first, almost nobody complains. That is what makes the phase so seductive. The public sees abundance. Politicians see room to promise more. Markets see liquidity. Financial media sees a new normal. But what is really happening is that the center is consuming trust faster than it is replenishing it. Then comes the challenge. Other powers that spent years watching begin to respond. Some accumulate hard assets. Some build trade networks outside the existing standard. Some settle bilateral agreements in local currencies. Some simply reduce their dependence quietly and pragmatically. The dominant power, feeling the ground move, typically responds with one of two instincts. It reaches for force or it reaches for financial engineering. Neither solves the underlying problem for long. Then after enough strain, enough debt, enough overconfidence, enough loss of credibility, the old order contracts, and a new one takes shape around the ruins of certainty. The people prepared for the change preserve purchasing power. The people unprepared discover that loyalty to the old measuring stick is not rewarded. That pattern is not ideology. It is not a fringe hobby. It is the central fact of monetary history. Rome understood it too late. At its height, Rome looked invincible. Its power was not a matter of opinion. It controlled a huge share of known economic activity. Its military presence secured trade. Its roads, laws, taxation, and administration created an order large enough that people assumed it would endure indefinitely. The denarius was not just a coin, it was an instrument of confidence. And confidence is the real reserve asset in every age. Then Rome began doing what great powers do when their obligations outgrow their discipline. It chose to fund empire without honest sacrifice. It clipped, it diluted, it reduced the silver content of the denarius again and again under Augustus. The coin still carried real metallic integrity. Centuries later, it was a shadow of what it had been. The silver content had been devastated. The appearance of money remained. The substance had been drained. That does not feel catastrophic at the start. Merchants keep trading. Officials keep speaking as though everything is manageable. Families keep using the same currency because habit is one of the strongest forces in economics. Then prices drift upward. Then trust weakens. Then the middle class, which lives inside the system rather than above it, absorbs the damage. By the time Rome entered the deep crisis of the 3rd century, the political chaos was only part of the story. The monetary damage had already been done. Emperors turned over rapidly, trade frayed, cities weakened, borders became harder to defend. Eventually, the western half of the empire gave way, and when it did, people holding political claims and debased coinage learned a hard lesson. The form of wealth had mattered more than they realized. Those holding productive land, food systems, hard stores of value, and claims tied to real output survived much better than those holding the official symbol of yesterday's order. The Dutch cycle moved faster, but the lesson was no different. The Dutch Republic built one of the most sophisticated financial systems the world had seen. Amsterdam was a genuine center of commercial intelligence. The guilder commanded trust. The Dutch East India Company was not merely a company. It was a machine for empire, finance, and scale. For a small nation to control such an enormous share of trade required discipline, ingenuity, and timing. It was a remarkable achievement. And like every remarkable achievement, it produced a dangerous temptation. When a system works beautifully, people start believing it is immune to excess. Debt rose, military costs rose, protection of trade routes became more expensive. Competition from Britain intensified confidence that creditors would always fund the Dutch position, created exactly the kind of psychological softness that later destroys reserve powers. The public debt burden swelled. Then the external shocks and strategic pressures arrived. Wars with Britain drained resources. French aggression intensified the strain. The financial center that had looked immovable began to migrate. First gradually, then unmistakably, capital is slow to question prestige. But once it starts moving, prestige tends to follow it out the door. London became more important, Amsterdam became less central. And the people that had once embodied the cutting edge of finance learned that financial innovation does not repeal the laws of overextension. The VOC eventually collapsed. The guilder lost its commanding role. The wealth did not disappear. It relocated. That is what wealth does when systems crack. It moves to wherever trust, productivity, and future claims look safer. Then came Britain. This case matters because it sits much closer to our own age and because the handoff from pound to dollar offers a direct ancestor to what people alive today still assume is permanent. At its height, Britain was extraordinary. The empire covered enormous portions of the globe. Sterling sat at the center of international trade. London was the capital of world finance. Commodity contracts, sovereign debt, insurance, and global credit were deeply tied to British institutions. If you had lived at the high point of that system, you would have found no shortage of intelligent men prepared to explain why it could go on indefinitely. That is what intelligent men always say near the top. But industrial leadership began to face competition. The United States and Germany grew stronger. Britain began leaning more on financial power and imperial reach than on unchallenged productive dominance. Then war arrived. The First World War was not simply a military trauma. It was a balance sheet trauma. Britain went from creditor to debtor at stunning speed. It sold overseas assets. It borrowed heavily. And it borrowed, very importantly, from the United States. That detail matters because the shift in financial gravity usually becomes visible before the official ceremony catches up. Britain tried to defend the old order. It tried to maintain parity. It tried to preserve prestige. But economic truth is not impressed by nostalgia. Deflation squeezed the economy. The interwar years exposed the weakness. The Great Depression finished what pride could not prevent. By the time Bretton Woods formalized the dollar's central role in 1944, the handoff was already deeply underway. The public likes clean dates. History prefers long transitions. By the time the formal transfer is recognized, the strategic transfer has usually been progressing for years. That is the lens I use when I look at the United States. Today, I do not begin with slogans about collapse. I begin with a long arc of reserve privilege. After the Second World War, the United States earned an extraordinary position. It had industrial supremacy, it had military reach, it had productive capacity, it had the advantage of emerging from global conflict in stronger relative condition than its major rivals. The Bretton Woods system placed the dollar at the center. The dollar's tie to gold at $35 an ounce gave the world a standard that felt grounded. Then the petrodollar arrangement extended the durability of that dominance. If you wanted energy, you needed dollars. If you wanted reserves, you held dollars. If you wanted to participate in the architecture of the post-war world, you moved through institutions that the United States shaped. That was not an accident. That was a real achievement. But every system that achieves reserve dominance eventually faces the temptation to exploit it. The United States entered its long middle phase not through one dramatic betrayal, but through a gradual erosion of monetary discipline. The gold window closed in 1971. That moment matters more than many people appreciate. Once convertibility ends, restraint becomes political rather than structural. And political restraint is almost always weaker than structural restraint. If a government can finance more by issuing claims on future taxpayers, politicians will find reasons to do it. If a central bank can absorb distortions to preserve short-term stability, officials will find reasons to do it. If markets reward liquidity more immediately than prudence, investors will learn the wrong lesson for a very long time. That is exactly what happened. In 1971, United States national debt was roughly $400 billion. Today, it is more than $34 trillion. The annual deficit keeps running far beyond what a sober system would call temporary. Interest expense alone has moved past $1 trillion a year. Think carefully about what that means. A nation with the world's reserve currency is now spending more just to service prior borrowing than it spends on many of the functions citizens assume are the core of government. That is not a side detail. That is the plot. The reserve issuer enjoyed decades in which it could borrow in its own currency, export inflation, absorb shocks, and rely on global demand for its liabilities. That privilege is real. But privilege encourages bad habits when people mistake it for immunity. The United States has lived through a long phase in which monetary expansion, deficit spending, asset inflation, and financial engineering could all be justified as manageable. Because the dollar still sat at the top of the system, most people never ask the right question. They ask whether the dollar is still dominant. The right question is whether dollar dominance is as unquestioned as it used to be. Those are not the same thing. The shift from unquestioned supremacy to increasingly conditional supremacy is where the real danger begins. That is why 2022 matters so much. When roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves were frozen after the invasion of Ukraine, many people focused only on the geopolitics of that particular conflict. I focused on the message sent to every other reserve holder in the world. If reserves held inside the Western financial structure can become inaccessible under sufficiently adversarial conditions, then reserve management is no longer just about yield and liquidity, it becomes about strategic vulnerability. The minute that realization spread, the logic of diversification changed. You did not need every country to admire Russia. You only needed every central bank to run the same cold calculation. What if one day my reserves become leverage in someone else as conflict? What if my national savings are not as neutral as I thought? What if the safest asset in nominal terms is not the safest asset in political terms? That is when behavior changed. Gold purchases by central banks accelerated. China increased buying with greater persistence. Countries that had lived comfortably inside a dollar-centered settlement world started exploring alternatives more aggressively. Saudi Arabia began showing greater openness to non-dollar transactions for oil. Brazil and Russia expanded bilateral settlement outside the dollar. The BRICS countries intensified discussions about alternative arrangements. You do not need a perfect rival currency to weaken the incumbent order. You only need enough important actors to reduce exposure at the margin. Then again at the margin, then again. That is how trust erodes in the real world. Not through one vote, through repeated hedging, through strategic workarounds, through reserve managers deciding that concentration risk is no longer acceptable. People often say there is no alternative to the dollar. I think that phrase hides a lazy assumption. There does not need to be one perfect alternative waiting on the shelf. History does not work that way. The pound did not lose its role because the dollar was already flawless and universally embraced at the very start of the transition. It lost its role because Britain's relative position weakened while confidence in its ability to remain the unquestioned center declined. The replacement only needs to be good enough, broad enough, and rising fast enough to erode the incumbent's margin of dominance. That is a very different standard, and it is exactly the standard investors overlook. When I hear people say America is different, I hear an old sentence wearing new clothes. Rome believed it was exceptional. The Dutch believed their sophistication made them indispensable. Britain believed empire and finance would preserve its role. Every declining reserve center tells itself a flattering story about uniqueness. Sometimes the flattering story is true in detail. It is never true enough to cancel arithmetic. The reserve issuer cannot expand debt indefinitely, degrade purchasing power indefinitely, weaponize access indefinitely, and assume that the rest of the world will remain indifferent indefinitely. That is not cynicism. That is simple institutional behavior. Others will adapt. Others are adapting. Another argument I hear is that technology will save the system. I admire productive innovation as much as any investor alive. I have spent my life paying attention to the power of businesses that genuinely improve human organization. But technology is not magic. Technology can raise productivity. It can improve margins. It can reduce labor hours. It can create entirely new industries. What it cannot do by itself is erase a mountain of debt, restore fiscal discipline, and reverse the political incentives that created structural deficits in the first place. That is the part optimists skip. A country can be technologically brilliant and financially strained at the same time. Those are not mutually exclusive conditions. If debt keeps compounding, if spending continues to outrun revenue, if interest costs keep taking a larger bite, productivity gains alone will not rescue the balance sheet. They may soften the path, they will not repeal the structure. That is why I do not dismiss artificial intelligence, but I also do not confuse it with a debt solution. The debt problem is a debt problem. The currency problem is a currency problem. The reserve credibility problem is a reserve credibility problem. Technology can live inside those problems. It does not automatically solve them. What does the late phase of a reserve cycle look like for ordinary people? It rarely looks like instant ruin. That is what makes it so deceptive. It looks like the cost of living rising faster than official comfort permits. It looks like wages struggling to keep up with everyday reality. It looks like savings accounts feeling safe while purchasing power quietly thins. It looks like bonds that appear prudent on paper but fail to preserve real value after inflation and tax. It looks like asset prices remaining elevated in nominal terms while becoming less impressive in real terms. It looks like households working harder to maintain what used to feel normal. It looks like retirees becoming more dependent on favorable markets because fixed income is not as fixed in purchasing power as they assumed. It looks like the middle class getting squeezed not by one apocalypse but by 1,000 recurring adjustments. That is the wealth transfer. People wait for the cliff because cliffs are dramatic, real wealth. Shifts often happen on slopes. Cash is one of the most misunderstood positions in that environment. People call cash safe because it does not move around on a statement. But a slowly debasing currency can do immense damage without ever frightening you in one day. If prices rise persistently, if the official inflation rate understates lived inflation, if the monetary unit itself keeps losing credibility, then large idle cash balances become a convenient way to lose ground politely. Long-duration bonds can be worse. If you lend money for decades at yields that do not truly compensate for inflation risk, fiscal risk, and currency risk, you can spend years mistaking nominal certainty for real security. The statement arrives, the coupon pays, the principal looks intact, the purchasing power drains anyway. That is not prudence, that is complacency dressed like prudence. So what tends to hold up better when the measuring stick is under stress? Throughout history, the answer has been surprisingly consistent. Hard assets. Claims on productive system stores of value that cannot be created with a keystroke. Gold sits at the center of that conversation for a reason. I do not think of gold the way I think of a business. It does not compound internally like a great company. It does not invent better products. It does not widen its moat. But it does something exceptionally important in periods of monetary strain. It stands outside the political convenience of printing. It is nobody else's liability. It does not require faith in a central bank's future restraint. It does not ask you to trust fiscal discipline that may never arrive. That is why central banks buy it when they become less comfortable with the existing order. The question many ordinary investors should ask themselves is simple. Why are the institutions closest to the plumbing of global money accumulating the one reserve asset that cannot be printed, while individuals remain heavily conditioned to trust only paper claims? That question deserves an honest answer. Geographic diversification matters more in this kind of environment than it did during the cleanest years of dollar supremacy. That does not then mean of the theatrical abandonment of American assets. It means understanding concentration risk for decades. Holding most of your savings in dollar-denominated claims could be defended by pointing to the dollar's reserve privilege. But when that privilege begins to erode at the margins, concentration starts working against you rather than for you. The same logic applies to real assets tied to energy, food, raw materials, transportation, and land. When a currency loses purchasing power, it takes more units of that currency to buy the same barrel, acre, ton, or bushel. People often say those assets are getting more expensive. Often the more accurate statement is that the measuring unit is getting weaker. That difference matters because it changes your mindset. You stop asking only which line on a chart is going up. You start asking which form of wealth is more insulated from monetary dilution. And once you ask that question, the world looks different. I want to be careful here. I am not saying tomorrow morning brings a dollar collapse. I am not saying the United States disappears. I am not saying panic is intelligent. History does not reward panic. It rewards preparation. The Roman transition took time. The British transition took time. Even when the direction becomes obvious in retrospect, the process usually unfolds over years and often over decades. That gives thoughtful people an advantage, but it is not an unlimited advantage. Windows do close. Assets do reprice. Protection does become more expensive once consensus arrives. People who wait for total clarity usually pay the highest price for whatever protection they finally decide they need. That is how human psychology works. They want no uncertainty, but the price of no uncertainty is that the opportunity has already gone. I have always believed that good investing is partly a test of emotional independence. Can you accept uncomfortable arithmetic before it is socially fashionable to do so? Can you act before the crowd feels safe acting? Can you preserve flexibility while others are still measuring everything by yesterday? That's assumptions. That is the real test here. The current system still functions. That is precisely why so many people are relaxed. Reserve transitions do not begin after the system stops functioning. They begin while the system still works well enough that complacency feels rational. That is why the signals matter. Now, global debt at extreme levels matters now. A $34 trillion federal debt burden matters. Now, persistent structural deficits matter. Now, interest expense above $1 trillion matters now. Central banks buying gold at the fastest pace since the late 1960s matters. Now, de-dollarization in trade arrangements matters now. The freezing of sovereign reserves and the resulting rethink inside central banks matters. Now, none of these by themselves guarantee a precise date. Together, they tell you the tide is no longer moving in the old direction. That is enough. When the tide turns, you do not need to know the exact day of the furthest retreat to know that standing in the same place may become a bad idea. At the deepest level, this is not only about economics, it is about humility. Great powers lose humility before they lose dominance. They begin to assume their status is a fact of nature instead of a temporary outcome of discipline, productivity, trust, and credible rules. Savers lose humility too. They assume the assets that worked in one era must always work in the same way. They assume the labels safe and risky are permanent. They assume a checking account is safe because the nominal number does not swing. They assume a government bond is safe because the issuer is large. They assume a reserve currency is safe because it has been central for a lifetime. History punishes those assumptions. The people who navigate these periods best are usually not the loudest. They are not the most ideological. They are not the ones shouting collapse every morning. They are the ones who see the direction of incentives, observe the behavior of serious institutions, recognize the pattern beneath the headlines, and quietly reposition before the crowd notices that the old map is no longer accurate. That is what I would want any serious saver to understand. If the measuring unit is being stretched, own some things that do not depend entirely on that unit is integrity. If the financial center is becoming less secure in relative terms, diversify your claims. If hard assets are being accumulated by the most informed reserve managers in the world, do not dismiss that behavior as superstition. If debt service is beginning to crowd out fiscal flexibility, do not comfort yourself with slogans about endless exceptionalism, and above all, do not confuse the absence of a dramatic immediate collapse with the absence of a wealth transfer. The transfer can be underway while the stock market is still open, while the retirement portal still loads, while the bond fund still mails a statement. While television still tells you the system is resilient, that is how the last transitions worked too. By the time everybody agreed, the decisive advantage belonged to those who had already moved. The central question is not whether history repeats itself in identical detail. It never does. The central question is whether the structural pattern is repeating in a recognizably similar form. I believe it is. A dominant reserve issuer built a great order. That order delivered real prosperity. The issuer then stretched the system through debt, money creation, and fiscal indiscipline foreign actors. Having observed both the internal strain and the geopolitical use of the system, began reducing reliance on it. Hard reserve assets started moving into stronger demand. Trust began thinning at the margins. That is the pattern. And when patterns this old begin to reappear, I pay attention. The transfer of wealth in these periods does not reward blind loyalty. It rewards clear thinking. It rewards flexibility. It rewards ownership of productive capacity, real claims, and stores of value that can survive a weaker measuring stick. It rewards the ability to separate nominal comfort from real safety. It punishes passivity disguised as prudence. It punishes those who think statements are wealth. It punishes those who wait until the headlines are unanimous. If historians later write about the great wealth transition of the early 21st century, they will probably not say the warning signs were hidden. They will say the signs were visible, but socially inconvenient. They will say the debt levels were obvious. They will say the reserve diversification by central banks was obvious. They will say the geopolitical fracture lines were obvious. They will say the monetary privilege had been stretched for too long. And they will likely say that many ordinary people remain concentrated in the exact assets most exposed to the slow erosion of purchasing power, because those assets still felt familiar. Familiarity has never been a sufficient investment principle. The world is changing in the way the world always changes when monetary leadership matures, overextends, and begins to be hedged against. That does not require despair. It requires adult thinking. The old rules do not vanish in one afternoon. They lose force little by little. At first, only the most attentive institutions behave differently. Then the large players shift, then the pricing follows, then the public notices, then the story is told as though it were sudden. It is almost never sudden. A man who understands this does not need to become hysterical. He needs to become deliberate. He needs to know what part of his savings is pure exposure to a single paper system. He needs to know which assets in his life depend on stable purchasing power assumptions that may not hold. He needs to know where his real flexibility comes from. He needs to stop measuring success only in nominal account values. He needs to ask a harder question: if the dollar buys less, if trust in the dollar order weakens further, if hard assets continue to be accumulated by the institutions closest to monetary power, am I positioned as though the next 20 years will look exactly like the last 40? If the answer is yes, he is not investing, he is extrapolating, and extrapolation is one of the costliest habits in finance. I do not know the precise month when the next visible break in confidence arrives. I do not need to know. I only need to know that the pattern is old, the signals are real, and the behavior of serious actors is changing already. That is enough to reject complacency. The great wealth shifts of history have always separated people into two groups. Not the smart and the foolish, not the educated and the uneducated, usually the prepared and the unprepared. The ones who saw that money itself was part of the investment question, not just the background wallpaper, protected themselves better. The ones who assumed the unit of account would stay trustworthy because it had always been trustworthy in their own lifetime, learned too late that monetary memory is shorter than civilizational history. I would rather stand with the people who respect history. I would rather respect the behavior of central banks buying hard reserve assets than the reassurances of people whose entire framework assumes the old order stays cheap forever. I would rather hold some claims on real things than spend my life defending paper certainty in an age of expanding paper promises. I would rather move early, calmly, and rationally than late, emotionally, and expensively. That is the whole point. The wealth shift does not begin when everybody agrees it has begun. It begins when the world starts preparing for a future that no longer revolves around unquestioned trust in the old center. That preparation is already visible. The debt is already here. The reserve diversification is already here. The monetary strain is already here. The only thing that remains uncertain is who will adapt before adaptation becomes obvious. If you want the simplest summary of what I believe, it is this: empires do not lose monetary leadership because they stop being powerful overnight. They lose it because they begin spending trust faster than they can earn it. Currencies do not fail savers because they suddenly disappear. They fail savers because purchasing power bleeds out over time while habits remain fixed. Wealth is not preserved by loyalty to an old measuring stick. It is preserved by owning what still matters when the measuring stick changes. And when I look at the debt, the deficits, the reserve behavior, the gold accumulation, the geopolitical response to reserve weaponization, and the long record of how great monetary orders mature and bend, I do not see a warning that belongs only to historians. I see a decision that belongs to everyone holding savings today. You can keep pretending the unit itself is stable because the statement still prints cleanly, or you can accept that the world may be entering one of those long transitions in which careful positioning matters more than comforting language, I know. Which side of that choice I prefer. I would rather be early to a structural truth than late to a social consensus that has served me well in business. It serves just as well in money. And in an age like this, money itself is the business you cannot afford to misunderstand.